The snow came down like falling shards of glass, numbing her skin as the heavy iron gates slammed shut. The metallic clang echoed through the desolate courtyard of the Silverwood outpost, ringing like a death knell in the freezing air. Elwyn Sterling stood on the wrong side of the threshold. The wind howled furiously, tearing at her hair and biting into her exposed flesh with the ferocity of a starved beast. She did not fall. She forced her bruised, bare feet to remain planted firmly on the frozen earth, even as the cold began to seep deeply into her bones. On the other side of the rusted iron bars stood her mother-in-law. Morgana Drain looked down at the exiled girl, with eyes as hard and unforgiving as polished stone. The older woman was draped in luxurious thick mink furs, her hands safely tucked into velvet muffs, completely untouched by the brutal winter storm that was already beginning to claim her daughter-in-law's life. Behind the cruel matriarch, a dozen pack members stood in oppressive silence. They watched with averted eyes, ashamed but entirely complicit in the cruelty unfolding before them. No one dared to speak. No one dared to challenge the decree of the highest-ranking female in the territory. You are stripped of your name, stripped of your rank, and cast out from the protection of this territory. Morgana's voice sliced through the howling wind, sharp and dripping with undeniable venom. You chose to defy the natural order, Elwyn. You chose to squander precious pack resources on a worthless runt. Now the winter will claim you, and Silverwood will be cleansed of your taint. The words hit her like a blade, sliding between ribs, not because they were unexpected, but because of the sheer, unadulterated malice radiating from the woman who was supposed to be her family. Elwyn had committed no crime of treason. She had stolen no gold from the treasury. She had merely waded into a freezing, treacherous ravine to pull a drowning, lower caste pup from the icy depths, while the rest of the pack had stood safely on the banks and watched him struggle. For the ultimate sin of showing mercy, she was being handed a public death sentence. She pulled the midnight cloak tighter around her trembling shoulders. The threadbare, dark grey woolen garment offered absolutely no real protection against the punishing gales of the frostbound epoch, but it was all she had left in this miserable world. It was a pathetic, fragile shield against an insurmountable storm. The fabric was already stiffening with frost, the frayed edges whipping violently in the violent wind. For years, she had endured their silent torments. For years, she had scrubbed their stone floors, eaten their meager scraps, and swallowed her pride just to survive under her mother-in-law's tyrannical roof. For years, she had hidden her sharp intelligence, suppressed her own inner strength, and allowed the entire territory to believe she was nothing but a weak, worthless Omega. But this was the definitive end of the line. There was no more running. There was no more hiding in the dusty shadows of the estate. Morgana smirked, leaning slightly closer to the iron bars, waiting eagerly for the inevitable collapse. She was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for the desperate, pathetic pleas for mercy that would feed her insatiable ego. She desperately wanted the outcast to crawl on her frozen knees, to scratch at the iron gates, and beg for a second chance to be their obedient servant. Elwyn did not give her the satisfaction. She did not weep. She did not beg. Instead, the fragile girl slowly lifted her chin. Her eyes, pale and striking against her frostbitten skin, locked onto the older woman's gaze with a terrifying absolute calm. She didn't utter a single syllable of protest. The heavy silence stretching between them became a weapon of its own, heavier than any physical blow, louder than any desperate scream. The young woman held the eye contact until the mother-in-law's arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a sudden, involuntary flicker of genuine unease. The outcast turned her back on the iron gates. She stepped away from the only home she had ever known. She stepped away from the warmth of the hearths, the safety of the stone walls, and the cruelty of her bloodline. Every step forward was a step deeper into the raging abyss of the winter whiteout. The blizzard swallowed her slender silhouette almost immediately, a chaotic swirl of blinding white erasing her existence from the outpost history. She didn't know what terrifying predators lay beyond the tree line. She didn't know how long her failing body would last in the negative temperatures. All she knew was that she would rather die on her feet in the wild than live another agonizing second on her knees in a cage. Silence. Only the screaming wind remained. The whiteout conditions were entirely blinding. The frost-bound epoch was notoriously ruthless, known for claiming the lives of fully grown, heavily furred alpha warriors, let alone a malnourished, exiled Omega, wearing nothing but a frayed piece of wool. Eluan pushed through the knee-deep snowdrifts, her bare feet long past the point of registering physical pain. They had become numb, heavy blocks of ice dragging her downward into the earth. Every breath she inhaled felt like swallowing a handful of pulverized glass. Her fragile lungs burned violently with the effort of Simpson's sting. Her vision blurred constantly, the edges of her sight darkening with the unmistakable, creeping shadow of severe hypothermia. She forced her legs to keep moving. She had to put as much distance between herself and the rusted gates as physically possible. She absolutely refused to let Morgana's guards find her frozen corpse clinging to the perimeter wall in the morning light. As she trudged past a cluster of twisted, frosted oak trees, a subtle movement caught her failing eye. Hidden carefully beneath the snow-laden branches, a small figure crouched in the freezing shadows. It was Toby Finch. The little pup was trembling uncontrollably, his tiny, bruised hands clutching the rough bark of the tree for support. His pale cheeks were stained with freshly frozen tears. The boy had watched the entire horrific banishment from his hiding spot. He had seen the only person who had ever shown him kindness be condemned to a frozen grave. Toby took a hesitant, desperate half-step forward, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing cry. He wanted to run out into the storm. He wanted to wrap his small, patched scarf around her neck, to drag her toward a hollowed-out log, to do absolutely anything to repay his massive life debt. But the sheer terror was paralyzing. If the enforcers caught him aiding the exiled traitor, his own impoverished family would be slaughtered before nightfall. The heavy weight of that fear chained the child to the roots of the ancient oak. Eluan paused in the deep snow. The raging wind aggressively whipped the dark hood from her head, exposing her freezing face to the merciless elements. She looked at the crying boy. There was no trace of anger in her heart. There was no bitter resentment for his perceived cowardice. He was just an innocent child, trapped in a toxic pack that constantly valued superficial status over basic survival. Through the blinding curtain of snow, she offered him a faint, microscopic nod. It was a silent, profound absolution, a gentle command to stay back in the shadows, a final plea for him to survive and live a good life, so her ultimate sacrifice would not be in vain. The boy choked on a ragged sob, pressing his face deeply into the tree bark to muffle the sound. The young woman turned her face back toward the howling wasteland and kept moving forward. The storm intensified rapidly, the temperature plummeting even further as the meager, grey daylight began to fade into a bruised, purple twilight. The cold was no longer just a harsh physical sensation. It was an invasive, living entity. It was a vicious predator sinking its teeth deep into her veins, aggressively draining the remaining life force from her fragile core. Her blood turned to ice, the violent shivering, which had racked her exhausted body so relentlessly for the past hour, suddenly and ominously stopped. That was the final lethal warning sign. Her mind, previously sharp and intensely focused on putting one foot in front of the other, began to drift into a hazy, dangerous lethargy. A strange, incredibly deceptive warmth began to bloom deep inside her chest. The snowy ground below her raw feet no longer looked like a freezing, desolate tomb. It looked incredibly soft. It looked peaceful and inviting. It looked exactly like a massive bed of white feathers, promising an eternal sanctuary from the endless, exhausting cruelty of the world. She stumbled blindly. Her frozen, unfeeling foot caught hard on a submerged, jagged tree root hidden beneath the powder, and she completely lacked the physical strength to catch herself. Eluan hit the ground with a sickening thud. The heavy impact violently knocked the remaining air from her burning lungs, but she didn't even attempt to push herself back up. She simply couldn't. Her muscles had entirely stopped receiving commands from her brain. The frayed cloak tangled uselessly around her fragile frame, quickly being buried by the relentless heavy snowfall. She curled onto her side, slowly pulling her numb knees to her chest in a desperate, final, instinctive attempt to preserve whatever fleeting body heat remained in her dying heart. She let her heavy eyes drift shut. The sharp, biting pain completely receded, quickly replaced by a profound, hollow numbness that wrapped around her like a blanket. She willingly surrendered her broken spirit to the raging storm, quietly waiting for the final, peaceful dark to take her away, never again, but the dark did not come. Right before her fading heart could beat its final sluggish rhythm, the frozen earth directly beneath her resting cheek began to tremble. It was a very faint vibration at first, easily mistaken for the lingering shivering of her own dying muscles. But the strange tremor quickly grew. It amplified rapidly into a deep, rhythmic thumping that powerfully cut through the chaotic shrieking of the blizzard. The ground physically shook with the overwhelming force of an approaching avalanche. The dying girl completely lacked the strength to open her sealed eyes, but she could acutely feel the sudden, massive shift in the atmospheric pressure. The biting, lethal wind that had been mercilessly tearing at her face was abruptly cut off, blocked entirely by a sudden wall of immense, living heat. Heavy, massive paws slammed hard into the deep snow surrounding her fragile, buried form. The distinct, terrifying sound of deep, primal animal panting completely filled the sudden silence around her. Through the narrow slits of her frost-sealed eyelids, a blurred, unbelievable vision slowly materialized. These were not the scrawny, grey timber wolves of her former territory. These beasts were absolutely gargantuan. They were terrifying monsters of ancient myth and legend, standing proudly as tall as heavily armored war horses, their thick fur a pristine, glowing white that seemed to magically defy the heavy darkness of the winter storm. It was the legendary Royal Patrol, the personal elite vanguard of the realm's supreme ruler, a fearsome faction that absolutely never strayed this far south, unless personally commanded by the throne itself. A massive, imposing shadow fell heavily over her small body. The absolute largest of the giant wolves, a terrifyingly beautiful creature with intelligent eyes the color of a raging winter storm, slowly lowered its enormous, scarred snout directly to her pale cheek. A sudden blast of hot, moist breath washed aggressively over the exiled girl's frozen face. The physical sensation was violently intense. The sheer, radiating heat rolling off the massive beast was exactly like a roaring blacksmith's forge, instantly and miraculously melting the thick crust of solid ice that had permanently sealed her delicate eyelashes shut. Warm water dripped slowly down her numb cheeks, feeling almost exactly like the tears she had refused to shed. The giant, terrifying beast inhaled deeply, drawing in the unique scent of her freezing skin, the damp wool of the tattered cloak, and the faint metallic tang of her chilled blood. And then the absolutely impossible happened. The massive, deadly wolf violently recoiled backward as if physically struck by a bolt of lightning. A low, incredibly ragged whine erupted painfully from its throat, a sound of absolute, devastating shock that shook the surrounding trees. The apex predator didn't bare its razor-sharp fangs. It didn't lunge forward for the easy kill. Instead, its massive front legs suddenly buckled entirely. The giant beast dropped its heavy chest directly into the deep snow, lowering its majestic, crowned head until its wet snout touched the frozen dirt right beside her numb, lifeless hand. A rapid ripple of sheer panic and absolute awe surged forcefully through the rest of the elite pack. One by one, without a single moment of hesitation, the giant white wolves dropped heavily to their bellies. They formed a tight, impenetrable, protective circle around the dying outcast, using their massive, fur-covered bodies as a living, breathing barricade against the lethal winter wind. From the very edge of the protective circle, a tall figure shifted seamlessly from beast to man. Garrick Hawk, the notoriously ruthless captain of the Alpha King's elite patrol, stood completely exposed in the freezing storm, entirely uncaring of the biting cold against his skin. His battle-hardened face, normally a perfect mask of impenetrable stoicism, was completely pale and stricken. His broad chest heaved erratically as he stared down in pure horror at the broken, exiled Omega curled pathetically in the snow. He recognized the truth instantly. The subtle scent was utterly unmistakable to his heightened senses. It was the absolute rarest, most sacred magic in their entire brutal world. A breathtaking fragrance of fresh rain and crushed pine that belonged to only one specific soul in all of existence. It was the undeniable scent of the fated mate. The long-lost queen of the Obsidian Palace. He had found her, and she was dying. By the ancestors, the captain rasped out, his deep voice trembling violently with a chaotic mixture of primal terror and absolute overwhelming reverence. He dropped heavily to one knee in the snow, completely ignoring the biting ice. He didn't dare reach out and touch her. He fully knew the lethal penalty for laying uninvited hands on the king's divinely chosen partner. His dark eyes widened significantly as he fully realized the catastrophic, bloody gravity of the situation. The Alpha King's fated mate was freezing to death on the desolate borders of a lowly, pathetic outpost. The entire realm was about to drown in an ocean of fire and blood. Elowyn couldn't possibly comprehend the terrifying sight of the giant beasts bowing submissively to her. She couldn't understand the fearsome captain's horrified, desperate whisper. The sudden, overwhelming rush of warmth from their massive bodies was simply too much for her fragile, rapidly failing system to process all at once. The violent, extreme shift in physical temperature severely shocked her fading brain. She let out one final incredibly shallow breath into the heated air. Then darkness swallowed her completely. The howling tempest outside the northern settlement faded into nothing against the suffocating panic seizing Garrick Hawke. The priest and captain of the elite patrol did not hesitate. He shattered the protective barricade his warriors had formed, dropping to his knees in the blood-chilling snow. His calloused hands trembled as he scooped the fragile unconscious girl into his massive arms. She weighed absolutely nothing. She felt like a delicate bird made of spun glass and ice. "Move," Garrick snarled at the blinding whiteout. His voice carried the primal terror of a man who held the realm's salvation in his hands. "Bring the royal transport now." Shadows parted. An iron-reinforced carriage, pulled by 6 black warhorses, tore through the blizzard and slammed to a halt a few yards away. Garrick threw himself inside the cabin, cradling Elowyn's frozen body against his armored chest. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, severing the screaming tempest from their reality. She remained locked in a lightless void. Elowyn did not feel the agonizing race across the frozen tundras. She did not hear the massive iron gates of the royal fortress crashing open in the dead of night. She did not feel the frantic hands of the royal healers peeling away the stiff, frozen remnants of her threadbare midnight cloak. For 15 hours, Elowyn Sterling drifted on the very edge of the abyss. Her pulse a failing, erratic drumbeat. Dawn came grey and cold on the second day, seeping through the towering glass windows of a chamber she did not recognize. The heavy darkness that had swallowed her whole finally fractured, splintering apart to let in a rush of confusing sensory information. The very first thing she registered was not the pain, but the impossible heat. It was a luxurious warmth that seeped directly into her marrow, fighting the frost that had gripped her veins. Elowyn forced her heavy eyelids to flutter open. Her vision swam. As her sight sharpened, the opulent surroundings of the king's ancestral citadel came into crisp focus. She was no longer lying in a desolate snowbank outside the outpost. She was buried beneath layers of crimson silk and the softest bearskin furs she had ever touched in her miserable life. "Do not try to move," a gentle voice instructed. From the shadows of the massive 4-poster bed, a slender woman stepped forward. Dr. Lyra Mercer, the lead royal handmaid and highest-ranking healer in the court, looked down at her with intense professional concern. Lyra held a porcelain cup radiating a fierce magical heat. "Drink this," Lyra whispered gently, sliding an arm behind Elowyn's shoulders to prop her up. "It is the solace draught." The steaming crimson liquid was a potent medicinal tea brewed with rare fire moss, designed to violently jumpstart a failing circulatory system. Elowyn parted her cracked lips. The liquid slid down her raw throat like liquid fire, eradicating the agonizing emptiness in her chest. A faint, rosy flush began to battle the deadly paleness of her sunken cheeks. Elowyn met the healer's gaze squarely. She did not weep. She did not beg. Her resilience had been forged in the darkest, most unforgiving fires of neglect. She simply swallowed the bitter tea and let her exhausted body sink back into the pillows, her stoic facade firmly in place. Lyra watched her with silent reverence, marveling at the quiet strength of the outcast who had survived the unsurvivable. Then the exhaustion pulled Elowyn under once more. Another night passed in a quiet, healing blur. By the morning of the third day, the violent tremors had entirely stopped. Elowyn sat up against the velvet headboard, her pale eyes tracking the flickering flames in the enchanted hearth. Then the temperature in the chamber plummeted, not from a winter draught, but from the raw power radiating off the man who suddenly pushed through the heavy mahogany doors. She didn't know. The man watching her from the shadows was the Alpha King. Caspian Vane was a terrifying vision of unchecked authority. Standing well over 6.5 feet tall, his broad shoulders were draped in a heavy midnight black pelt that swallowed the surrounding light. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, a curse wearing a crown. He had come to the Royal Healing Ward, expecting to inspect the mysterious outcast his patrol had risked everything to save. Caspian's heavy, steel-toed boots crunched rhythmically against the marble floor. His expression was a flawless mask of indifference, a stoic facade maintained through a decade of bloody conquests and lonely rulership, but as he stepped within 5 feet of the bed, a blinding, ethereal light erupted from his right hand. The monarch froze mid-step. He raised his hand, staring in absolute shock at the heavy platinum signet ring adorning his index finger. The lunar crest, a sacred royal artifact that had remained dormant and lifeless for his entire existence, was glowing with the intensity of a captured star. The metal grew searing hot against his skin, pulsing in frantic time with his racing heartbeat. His breath hitched. The air vanished from his lungs. Caspian's composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. He dropped to his knees right there on the pristine marble floor, uncaring of his luxurious royal garments. His storm-grey eyes locked onto the fragile, battered figure sitting in his bed. The scent hit him like a physical blade sliding between ribs. Pine needles, fresh rain, and a subtle sweetness that belonged exclusively to his soul. "No," Caspian rasped out, his deep voice cracked with primal desperation. His calloused hands that had casually broken the necks of rival warlords, trembled violently as he reached out. He saw the fading purple bruising of frostbite on her cheeks. He saw how painfully thin she was. The Alpha King's fated mate had been starving. She had been left to die in the dirt. A feral sound, half sob and half roar, ripped through the ruler's throat. The atmospheric pressure grew so heavy the glass vials on Lyra's distant medical cart shattered. Caspian couldn't stay away a fraction of a second longer. The magnetic pull of their destiny dragged him forward until he sank heavily onto the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his immense weight. He reached out with a trembling hand, his calloused fingers hovering a fraction of an inch above her cheek, terrified that his mere touch might break her. She didn't flinch. She took a tiny, shallow breath and leaned an incredibly small fraction of an inch into his waiting palm. The bond snapped into place like a lock clicking shut. A shockwave of molten gold magic erupted outward from the exact point where their skin met. Elowen gasped out loud as a surge of vibrant life force flooded her battered veins, erasing the lingering ache in her bones in mere seconds. Caspian let out a shuddering, broken exhale. The murderous tension that had gripped his massive frame melted away, replaced by a wave of devastating tenderness. He gently stroked his thumb across her cheekbone. He watched her like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest and settle into hers. Silence. The supreme ruler of the realm slowly reached for the silver bowl of broth Lyra had left on the nightstand. Caspian dismissed all formal protocols. He scooped a modest portion of the savory liquid with a polished spoon, blowing on it carefully. The temperature had to be perfect. He offered it to her. Elowen looked up into the fierce eyes of the warlord serving her. Hours ago she had been treated as worse than dirt. Sold, traded, and disposed of. Now, a man who possessed enough military power to conquer the world was feeding her. She parted her lips and accepted the broth. "Eat slowly," Caspian murmured. His deep, rumbling voice vibrated pleasantly in the massive chamber. "Your body needs time to remember how to accept strength." Elowen swallowed quietly. She maintained her characteristic dignity, her spine straight even against the pillows. "Why did they cast you out?" Caspian finally asked. The question was spoken gently, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of lethal violence lurking beneath the words. His inner beast was viciously pacing its mental cage, demanding an ocean of blood to avenge this insult. Elowen didn't look away from him. "My mother-in-law," Elowen began. Her voice was a raspy whisper that carried the heavy weight of absolute truth. "Morgana Drain. She controls the territory. She ordered the iron gates of the Silverwood outpost sealed behind me. Caspian's jaw clenched, a muscle ticked visibly beneath his bearded cheek. He didn't interrupt her, though his knuckles turned white around the silver spoon. There was a child, she continued smoothly, her pale eyes reflecting the golden magic still humming between them. Toby, a lower caste pup. He fell into the freezing ravine near the perimeter wall. The others simply stood on the banks and watched him drown. They didn't want to risk their own lives on a runt. She paused. The physical proximity to the massive alpha was strangely anchoring. I went into the icy water, Elowen stated simply, refusing to glorify her own suicidal bravery. I pulled him out. I gave him my body heat until he woke up. For that crime, Morgana declared I had defied the natural order. She stripped me of my status and threw me into the blizzard. Crack! The solid mahogany nightstand splintered under the crushing pressure of Caspian's left hand. The sharp sound echoed loudly. The king's irises had darkened into pits of terrifying obsidian. The thought of his selfless mate being tortured, simply because she possessed the courage her entire pack lacked, sent a paralyzing shock of absolute dread through his core, which then ignited into unquenchable fire. Caspian set the silver bowl aside. He reached out, gently enveloping both of her small hands within his massive ones. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a reverent, lingering kiss against her skin. It was a solemn, unbreakable vow. "Silverwood will burn," he stated softly. It wasn't an empty threat. It was a fact of nature. "No one will ever look down on you again, my queen, and the woman who locked that gate will beg for a death I will refuse to give her." He carefully adjusted the heavy furs around her fragile shoulders, sealing her inside his impenetrable fortress of safety. Elowen simply nodded once. She had survived the ice. Now she would watch them burn. The healing magic surging from their initial connection had fortified Elowen's battered body faster than any mundane medicine. By mid-afternoon, the violent tremors had ceased entirely, leaving behind a strange, resonant calm in her chest. She insisted on standing. Caspian did not try to stop her. He merely hovered inches away, his towering frame radiating a protective heat that chased away the frost creeping along her veins. They were to present themselves before the entire court of the realm's capital. A fated bond was an undeniable law of nature, but a royal crowning required the sacred public witness of the realm's highest officials. The heavy doors of the healing ward groaned open. Caspian flatly refused to let her walk. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, lifting her against his chest as if she weighed no more than a breath. Elowen rested her head against his broad shoulder, listening to the thundering rhythm of his heart beneath the dark leather. She had spent her entire existence being told she was a burden. She didn't know what it meant to be cherished. She didn't know what it meant to be safe. And she certainly didn't know the most dangerous predator in the hemisphere would carry her through his ancestral home as if she were the beating of his own heart. They arrived at the towering gates of the Grand Hall, the oldest sanctuary within the Grand Estate. The colossal obsidian doors swung inward, groaning under the immense weight of centuries of bloody history. Thousands of elite warriors, noble lords, and high-ranking pack officials filled the cavernous hall. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine and the electric anticipation of a restless empire. As Caspian stepped over the threshold with his mate secured in his arms, the entire assembly fell into a deafening silence. He carried her to the base of the towering marble steps leading to the altar, setting her down with agonizing care. Elowen straightened her spine. She was still wearing the simple garments he had provided, her silver hair loose and untamed, but she held herself with the unbreakable dignity of a conqueror. She did not shrink beneath the judging stares of the gathered elite. She did not avert her gaze. She simply lifted her chin. Waiting at the pinnacle of the raised altar was Garrick Hawke, the fierce patrol captain who had physically pulled her from the freezing snowbank, had temporarily shed his heavy combat armor. He was now draped in the sweeping, intricate crimson vestments of the high priest of the pack. His scarred expression was a mixture of profound reverence and absolute, solemn duty. In his large hands, he held a chalice carved from pure, unblemished moonstone, the ancient magical vessel used exclusively to bind the souls of the ruling monarchs. "Step forward," Garrick intoned, his deep, commanding voice carried flawlessly across the silent, breathless hall. Elowen took the first deliberate step up the marble stairs. Caspian moved perfectly in sync with her, his massive shoulder brushing gently against hers with every upward movement. Every single time their skin made contact, tiny, crackling sparks of golden magic danced in the cold air between them, visible to every widening eye in the massive room. There could be no doubt left in the minds of the nobility. No political maneuver, no dark witch's illusion, and no forced arrangement could ever fake the primal, explosive resonance of a true fated mate connection. They reached the flat summit of the altar. The priest slowly lowered the moonstone chalice. For 10 agonizing years, the throne of this great kingdom has remained solitary and cold. Garrick spoke, his intense gaze locked respectfully on Elowen rather than his king. The realm has bled in the darkness. The winter has encroached upon our borders, freezing our crops and testing our endurance. But the goddess does not abandon her loyal children. From the freezing depths of ultimate betrayal, she has delivered our true salvation. He produced an intricate, wicked-looking silver dagger from his crimson robes. Caspian extended his massive right palm without a fraction of hesitation. Garrick made a swift, shallow cut directly across the king's lifeline. Bright crimson blood welled up instantly, dripping slowly and rhythmically into the sacred vessel. The monarch did not even blink. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, remained entirely fixed on the resilient woman standing beside him. "Your hand, my queen," Caspian whispered. His tone was incredibly soft, reserved entirely for her, despite the thousands of listening ears straining to hear him below. Elowen offered her small, pale hand to the blade. The silver edge stung her flesh, but it was merely a fleeting, insignificant pinch compared to the agonizing torture of the blizzard she had recently endured. Her blood dripped down, mingling directly with his inside the ancient chalice. The very second the 2 distinct lifelines touched within the moonstone basin, the liquid violently erupted. A pillar of blinding, molten golden light shot upward from the chalice, illuminating the vaulted ceilings of the colossal throne room like a captured sun. The intense, crackling magic swept outward in a massive physical shockwave, washing over the assembled crowd in a breathtaking rush. It was not a destructive force. It was pure, unadulterated warmth. The phantom winter that had plagued the emotional core of the kingdom for a decade was instantly shattered, replaced by the blooming heat of 1,000 hearth fires. Garrick dipped 2 fingers into the glowing, magical mixture. He reached out and marked Caspian's forehead with a swift stroke, then turned carefully to Elowen, tracing the ancient sacred rune of the Luna across her pale, flawless skin. "I present your true Luna," the priest roared. He raised his arms to the illuminated ceiling, his voice trembling with sheer awe. The mother of the realm, the fated mate of the Alpha King, bound by ancient blood, recognized by sacred magic, and protected by the absolute wrath of the gods. The reaction of the court was instantaneous and overwhelming. As one massive synchronized entity, the thousands of hardened wolves in the grand hall dropped heavily to their knees. The metallic sound of their armor, striking the stone floor, echoed like a rolling thunderclap. They bowed their heads in absolute, unquestioning submission to the fragile woman standing at the altar. Caspian finally turned his full body toward her. He did not care about the kneeling thousands waiting for his command. He gently framed her face with his large, calloused hands, his thumb brushing tenderly over the glowing rune, marking her forehead. The mate bond pulsed wildly between them, an unbreakable thrumming chord of pure, possessive devotion. "Mine," he rasped, pressing his warm lips directly to her crown. "Yours," she whispered back into the quiet space between them. The bond snapped into place like a lock clicking shut. The sacred ceremony was complete. The broken outcast who had been thrown away into the ice was now officially the highest authority in the known world. Following the exhausting, sensory overload of the crowning ritual, Elowen was immediately escorted away from the public eye and guided back toward the private royal wing. The transition from the massive, staring crowds to the intimate, quiet solitude of the king's personal chambers was jarring but deeply, desperately necessary. She needed to wash away the last lingering remnants of the Silverwood outpost from her body. She needed to forcefully scrub the agonizing memory of the dirt, the biting snow, and the public humiliation from her skin before she could truly accept her new reality. The royal bathing chamber was a breathtaking masterpiece of sculpted black marble and naturally heated thermal springs. Lyra Mercer and a carefully selected team of silent, incredibly respectful handmaidens guided her down the steps into the steaming, fragrant water. The enveloping heat was absolutely magnificent. It penetrated deep into her aching, tired muscles, soothing the microscopic, painful fractures left behind by the deadly frostbite. Rich infusions of crushed lavender, rare golden lotus petals, and soothing oils were gently massaged into her scalp, washing away the stubborn grime and despair of her unjust banishment. She sat completely still in the warm water and closed her eyes. She did not weep. She did not beg for reassurance. She had promised herself on that freezing night that she would never shed another useless tear for the toxic family that had thrown her away like garbage. The bathwater turned slightly murky with the residual dust of her painful past, and as it drained slowly away down the silver grates, so did her suffocating identity as a worthless, invisible omega. When she finally stepped out of the healing pool, the handmaidens immediately wrapped her in heated, incredibly plush towels. They did not dress her in the oversized, mismatched furs she had worn earlier. Instead, they carefully brought out the true garments of a reigning monarch. Elowen was systematically draped in a breathtaking, flowing gown of midnight blue silk, heavily embroidered with delicate silver threads that perfectly mirrored the winter constellations. The expensive fabric clung elegantly to her slender frame, heavy enough to keep her perfectly warm, but soft enough not to irritate her sensitive, healing skin. A magnificent cloak of pure, unblemished white fox fur was fastened securely around her delicate shoulders with a heavy platinum clasp. She looked up into the floor-to-ceiling mirror mounted on the wall. The woman staring back at her was no longer the bruised, ragged girl who had collapsed outside the iron gates waiting for death. She was a dangerous weapon forged in ice, polished by ancient magic, and backed by the most lethal army on the continent. The heavy door of the dressing room clicked open. Caspian stepped inside the chamber, his presence instantly altering the atmospheric pressure. The Alpha King froze dead in his tracks. He had changed from his heavy, restrictive ceremonial armor into a comfortable dark tunic and fitted trousers, looking slightly less like a conquering warlord and more like a man deeply, violently consumed by love. He stared at Elowen from across the room. His broad chest heaved with a sharp, sudden intake of breath. He was completely captivated, struck utterly silent by the radiant, commanding beauty of his fully restored, fated mate. "Leave us," he commanded the handmaidens. His voice was thick, raspy, and overflowing with raw, unfiltered emotion. The servants bowed quickly, their eyes averted in deep respect, and vanished into the corridors, pulling the heavy wooden doors firmly shut behind them. Caspian slowly closed the physical distance between them. When he finally stood directly before her, he didn't reach for her waist. He didn't try to pull her into a dominant embrace. Instead, he simply dropped to one knee. The most dangerous, feared man in the hemisphere knelt willingly before her on the velvet rug. He reached up and took both of her small hands in his, the heavy platinum of his lunar crest pressing warmly against her skin as he buried his face reverently in her soft palms. She could actually feel a slight, uncontrollable tremor vibrating through his broad shoulders. It was the ultimate, staggering display of groveling devotion, the silent confession of a supreme apex predator, completely surrendering his absolute dominance to the one fragile soul that truly owned his heart. "I will spend the rest of my miserable, blood-stained life trying to be worthy of you," he whispered fiercely against her skin, his breath hot and desperate. "You will never know the terrible feeling of a cold wind again. You will never know the ache of hunger. You will never know the grip of fear. I will tear the entire sky down before I let a single drop of rain touch you without your explicit permission." Elowen looked down at the dark hair of her kneeling king. She gently extracted one hand from his grip and slowly threaded her slender fingers through his thick locks. The incredibly simple, tender gesture caused a choked, broken sound to escape the back of his throat. He leaned heavily into her touch, starved for the gentle affection she provided so freely. "Show me my new home, Caspian," she murmured softly, her voice steady and clear. He stood up. his stormy eyes burning with renewed protective purpose. He offered his strong arm, and she gracefully took it. He led her out of the bathing chambers and deep into the most secure, restricted section of the royal residence, a hidden sanctuary designed exclusively for the safety of the royal family. The thick stone walls here were lined with massive, roaring fireplaces that kept the ambient temperature blissfully, permanently warm. Thick, woven carpets completely muffled their footsteps. He showed her the private libraries filled to the brim with ancient, leather-bound tomes, the sunlit indoor gardens where exotic, vibrant flora bloomed effortlessly despite the harsh winter raging outside, and the massive, heavily fortified sleeping quarters that smelled deeply of pine, leather, and absolute safety. This was her ultimate sanctuary, a fortress built specifically to protect a queen. As they stood closely together by the towering glass windows overlooking the snow-covered mountain peaks, a sharp, urgent knock echoed loudly from the heavy oak doors of the study. Caspian's relaxed posture instantly shifted. The gentle, adoring mate entirely vanished in the blink of an eye. The brutal, calculating Alpha King ruthlessly returned, his massive muscles coiling with lethal, predatory tension. "Enter," he barked, his voice sharp like a cracking whip. Garrick Hawk stepped quickly into the room, his expression grim and completely stripped of his priestly calm. He held a thick, heavily sealed parchment in his gauntleted hand. The urgent military briefing from the southern borders had finally arrived. Caspian turned back to Elowen, his harsh demeanor softening for a tiny fraction of a second. "Rest here by the fire, my heart. I must attend to the vanguard commanders immediately." He kissed her forehead, lingering for a long moment as if desperately trying to absorb her warmth into his own body. Then he turned and walked toward the heavy door. He watched her smile softly in the flickering firelight before he finally stepped out, moving slowly, like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest, utterly terrified to leave her side even for a single moment. But the brutal vengeance of a king could wait no longer. The atmosphere inside the subterranean war room of the sovereign's stronghold was suffocatingly tense and thick with impending violence. The massive circular table, carved flawlessly from a single unbroken slab of black granite, was entirely surrounded by the highest-ranking, blood-tested commanders of the royal army. Iron torches flickered erratically along the damp stone walls, casting long, menacing shadows over the heavily armored men. When Caspian strode aggressively into the chamber, the temperature in the room seemed to physically plummet. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge. His stance screamed a single feral warning to the entire world. "Touch her, and you die." He did not bother taking his customary elevated seat at the head of the table. Instead, he paced the length of the room like a caged, starved beast waiting for the iron gate to drop. "Report," the Alpha King snarled. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated ominously through the thick floorboards. A frontline scout, still covered head to toe in the freezing mud of a grueling long-distance ride, stepped forward nervously. He swallowed hard, visibly trembling under the terrifying, predatory scrutiny of his sovereign. "Your Majesty," the scout began, hastily unrolling a battered, hand-drawn map across the granite. "We successfully infiltrated the outer perimeter of the disgraced territory under the cover of the blizzard as commanded. The situation inside the walls is dire. Morgana Drain has officially declared a total martial lockdown. She has forcefully assumed the title of Acting Alpha, exploiting the total absence of the Elder's intervention to seize absolute control." Caspian's eyes narrowed into deadly, calculating slits. "And the innocent pup, the one my mate risked her own life to save from the river." The scout paled dramatically. He looked down at his muddy boots, clearly terrified to deliver the next piece of intelligence to the ticking time bomb standing before him. The boy, Toby Finch, was violently dragged from his home and thrown into the underground isolation cells along with his mother. Morgana decreed that any family holding sympathy for the traitor Elowen would be starved. They have been entirely denied their winter rations for 2 full days. She is actively making an example of them to terrify the rest of the pack into submission. The words hit Caspian like a blade sliding between ribs. It wasn't because he inherently cared for the complicated pack politics of the lower castes, but because he instantly, viscerally felt the phantom echo of Elowen's immense pain. His mate had sacrificed absolutely everything, pushing her own fragile body to the brink of death to pull that freezing child from the icy water. And now, that toxic, arrogant woman was systematically undoing her beautiful sacrifice just to satisfy her own twisted, pathetic ego. Crack, the heavy, impenetrable granite war table violently fractured straight down the middle as Caspian slammed his bare fist into the solid stone. A thick cloud of grey dust plumed abruptly into the stagnant air. The hardened commanders flinched collectively, instinctively taking a cautious step back from the radiating, explosive blast of pure, murderous intent rolling off their king. "High treason," Caspian whispered. The chilling quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than any deafening scream could ever be. "She deliberately tortures the very pack members my Luna deemed worthy of saving. She openly mocks the blood sacrifice of the crown." He turned slowly to Garrick, who stood rigidly at attention by the broken table, his large hand resting firmly on the worn hilt of his broadsword. "Captain," the king commanded, his eyes burning with unnatural, molten gold, "mobilize the Obsidian Vanguard immediately. Every single elite unit we possess. I want 5,000 heavily armored warwolves standing at the borders of that wretched compound before the sun falls tonight." Garrick slammed his armored fist over his heart in a crisp, violent salute. "It will be done, my king. We do not offer them standard terms of surrender," Caspian continued, his voice echoing harshly off the stone walls with ruthless, terrifying finality. "We do not negotiate with toxic abusers. We will rip their heavy iron gates completely off their rusted hinges. We will drag the cowardly elders straight from their comfortable, warm hearths. And Morgana Drain," he paused, a dark, sadistic promise slowly forming in the chaotic depths of his storm-grey eyes. "Morgana Drain will learn exactly what happens when you throw the Alpha King's soulmate into the freezing dark. I want her taken alive. She needs to be fully conscious when I force her to crawl through the snow and kneel at Elowen's feet." The entire War Council erupted into synchronized, bloodthirsty salutes. The violent anticipation in the room was a palpable, living entity, a shared, primal hunger to exact brutal justice for the fragile woman who now held their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Caspian looked down at the fractured, ruined map of the Silverwood territory. His inner beast clawed viciously at his chest, incredibly eager to taste the metallic blood of the woman who had dared to harm his fated mate. The long era of their sickening arrogance was over. The era of the outcast had officially begun. "Move out," Caspian roared. The heavy wooden doors of the war room swung violently open, and the absolute, calculated destruction of Elowen's former life officially commenced. The earth did not simply tremble. It shuddered like a dying animal. Deep within the fortified walls of the isolated fortress, the vibrations began as a subtle rhythmic thrumming beneath the frozen floorboards, slowly escalating into a deafening roar. In the central command hall, Morgana Drain sat rigidly by the hearth. She held a porcelain teacup in her aged, manicured hands, but the dark liquid inside was violently sloshing over the delicate rim, staining her expensive lace cuffs. She frowned, brushing a stray drop of tea from her wrist with an irritated flick of her fingers. The arrogant usurper assumed it was merely an avalanche in the distant eastern peaks. She had spent the last 48 hours reveling in her stolen authority, utterly convinced that casting her daughter-in-law into the deadly storm had permanently secured her bloodline's absolute dominance. She was wrong. The heavy wooden doors of the outpost main hall burst open, slamming against the stone walls with a terrifying crack. A perimeter guard stumbled into the room, his chest heaving, his face drained of all color. He didn't bother to bow. He didn't even address the elders gathered nervously around the hearth. He simply pointed a violently trembling, frostbitten finger toward the northern courtyard. "The Vanguard," the guard gasped out, his voice cracking in sheer, unadulterated panic. "The Obsidian Vanguard, they are here." Morgana dropped the porcelain cup. It shattered into a dozen jagged pieces against the stone floor, the hot tea pooling like dark blood. She pushed herself up from the velvet chair, her heart hammering erratically against her ribs. The old woman rushed past the bewildered elders, throwing her heavy woolen cloak over her shoulders, and practically sprinted toward the battlements, overlooking the main gate. She expected to see a rogue pack. She expected to see scavengers. She did not expect to see the apocalypse. Stretching across the snow-covered horizon, completely eclipsing the winter landscape, were 5,000 heavily armored war-wolves of the Royal Army. They did not howl. They did not snarl. They stood in absolute, terrifying, disciplined silence, their massive paws sinking into the snow, their dark steel armor absorbing the weak winter sunlight. The sheer, crushing pressure of their combined aura was suffocating. It pressed down on the outpost like a physical weight, making it incredibly difficult for the defending guards on the walls to even draw breath. At the very front of the lethal formation, standing mere yards from the rusted iron gates of Silverwood, was Caspian Vane. The Alpha King did not wear a crown of gold, but he did not need one. The absolute, lethal authority rolling off his towering frame was undeniable. He stared at the heavy iron barriers that had been callously slammed shut in his fated ensmate's face just days prior. His eyes, usually the color of a winter storm, were now glowing with a molten, feral amber. His chest rose and fell in slow, calculated breaths. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to demand terms. He stepped forward. A collective gasp echoed from the archers positioned on the outpost walls. No one dared to notch an arrow. To attack the sovereign was an instant, undeniable death sentence. Caspian approached the center of the massive gate. He did not signal for a battering ram. He did not order his soldiers to attack. The monarch simply raised his large, leather-clad hands and gripped the rusted, frozen iron bars. He didn't even shift into his wolf. Relying entirely on the raw, terrifying, primal strength of his royal blood, Caspian pulled. The sound of screeching metal ripped through the freezing air. The massive iron hinges, frozen solid by a decade of winter, began to violently buckle. Morgana watched from the high wall, her blood turned to ice, as the invincible gates of her territory were effortlessly torn from their stone foundations. With a final deafening crash, Caspian rips the heavy doors entirely off their tracks and hurled them carelessly into the snow. The barrier was gone. The sanctuary of the abusers was completely laid bare. Silence. "Bring them out," Caspian commanded. His voice was a low, guttural rasp that carried effortlessly to every single trembling ear within the compound. Every last one of them. Panic erupted. The obsidian vanguard surged forward like a tidal wave of dark steel, flooding through the breached entrance in perfect, terrifying synchronization. They did not draw their swords, for there was absolutely no resistance. The outpost guards immediately dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in the snow, pressing their foreheads to the dirt in desperate, pathetic submission. Within mere minutes, the elite soldiers had systematically dragged the terrified elders, the complicit guards, and the screaming mother-in-law out of their warm halls and into the biting cold of the open courtyard. Morgana was roughly thrown to the frozen ground, her knees striking the exact patch of ice where she had callously watched her daughter-in-law collapse. She scrambled to look up, her grey hair falling wildly out of its tight, aristocratic pins. Caspian stood over her like a vengeful god. His broad shoulders blocked out the sun. "Your Majesty," Morgana stammered, her previous arrogance completely vaporizing under his lethal glare. She pressed her hands into the freezing mud, attempting a clumsy, desperate bow. We did not know you were coming. The Silverwood pack is ever loyal to the crown. If you seek tribute, we have grain. We have silver." The Alpha King did not even look at her. His disgust was so profound, so entirely absolute, that addressing her directly felt like a stain on his honor. Instead, he slowly turned his massive head toward the breached gates. A colossal, luxurious royal carriage, constructed of dark mahogany and reinforced with polished steel, rolled smoothly into the ruined courtyard. It was drawn by 4 massive midnight black draft horses, their breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke. The heavy transport came to a gentle, precise halt directly in the center of the kneeling pack. The carriage door opened. The entire pack held its breath as a single, slender leg stepped out, clad in a delicate, silver-embroidered slipper that had never touched common mud. Then the new Luna emerged. Ello and Sterling stood before the people who had thrown her away. A collective, strangled gasp rippled through the hundreds of kneeling wolves. The elders stared in sheer, unadulterated horror. She was not the ragged, bruised, shivering outcast they had banished into the blizzard. She was draped in a breathtaking midnight blue silk gown, perfectly shielded from the bitter wind by a magnificent white fox fur cloak. The heavy platinum clasp at her throat caught the light, but it was nothing compared to the radiant, untouchable power glowing softly in her eyes. The ancient, sacred rune of the Luna was perfectly visible on her pale forehead, marking her undeniably as the supreme mother of the realm. The words hit her like a blade sliding between ribs. Morgana stared at the radiant queen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Her mind violently rejected the reality playing out in front of her. It was impossible. The worthless, invisible girl she had sentenced to death was standing at the pinnacle of the world, protected by the most dangerous predator on the continent. Caspian immediately stepped to Elowen's side. He did not pull her behind him to protect her. He stood slightly behind her shoulder, positioning himself as her impenetrable shield, allowing her to take the absolute center stage. He gently rested his large, calloused hand on the small of her back. It was a silent, incredibly powerful gesture of pure devotion. "You," Morgana whispered, her voice cracking. "It cannot be. You are a wolfless stray. You are nothing." Elowen didn't flinch. She did not yell. She did not allow a single tear of vindication to fall from her eyes. She simply looked down at the older woman with a chilling, absolute calmness that was far more devastating than any physical blow. She possessed the stoic, unbreakable dignity of a mountain. "I am Elowen Sterling," she spoke. Her voice was soft, yet it resonated with an ancient, magical authority that forced the surrounding vanguard warriors to bow their heads in deep reverence. "Luna of the Obsidian Palace, and I have returned for what is mine." Before Morgana could process the claim, a commotion broke out near the holding cells. 2 elite royal guards emerged from the subterranean isolation block, gently leading a small, incredibly frail figure up into the daylight. It was Toby Finch. The innocent pup was shivering violently, his clothes dirty, his face gaunt from 2 days of deliberate starvation. When Elowen saw the child she had nearly died to save, the stoic mask cracked just a fraction. A flash of pure protective maternal fury flared in her eyes. She moved forward, the heavy silk of her gown sweeping gracefully across the snow. She dropped to her knees right in the mud, completely disregarding her royal finery, and pulled the trembling boy into a fierce, desperate embrace. The child buried his face in her warm fur cloak, sobbing uncontrollably as the golden, healing magic of the Luna washed over him, instantly soothing his hunger and terror. Caspian watched his mate comfort the child. The sight of her infinite, beautiful compassion violently collided with the memory of her near death. The Alpha King's restraint finally, spectacularly snapped. He lunged forward. Before anyone could blink, Caspian seized Morgana by the thick collar of her cloak and hoisted her effortlessly into the air. The older woman shrieked, her legs kicking uselessly as she dangled above the frozen ground. "You locked my soulmate out in the ice," Caspian snarled, his voice a demonic, vibrating growl that made the surrounding elders weep in terror. "You starved an innocent pup to feed your own pathetic ego. You have poisoned this land for the very last time." With a brutal, sweeping motion, Caspian slammed Morgana back into the dirt, directly at Elowen's feet. He pressed his heavy steel boot firmly onto the back of her neck, forcing her face deep into the freezing, muddy slush. "Strip her of her rank," the king ordered his guards. "Burn the pack insignia from her registry. She is to be banished to the barren northern wastes, no food, no shelter, exactly as she decreed for my queen." Morgana thrashed wildly in the mud, sobbing, finally begging for the mercy she had never once shown to anyone else. "Please, Elowen, tell him, I raised you, I am your family." Elowen slowly stood up, holding little Toby securely against her side. She looked down at the pathetic, groveling creature in the snow. She didn't feel rage anymore. She didn't feel triumph. She only felt a profound, exhausting emptiness when she looked at the woman who had tormented her for a decade. The realization washed over her like a gentle tide. This toxic, miserable place held absolutely no power over her anymore. "You are not my family," Elowen said quietly. The absolute lack of emotion in her voice was the final, devastating blow. "My family is waiting for me at home." She didn't wait to watch the guards drag the screaming usurper away. She didn't look at the pathetic elders, desperately bowing their heads to the dirt. Elowen simply turned her back on the ruined settlement. She walked gracefully back toward the royal carriage, guiding the rescued pup along with her. Caspian watched her go, his chest swelling with an overwhelming, suffocating amount of pride. He removed his boot from the dirt, leaving the ruins of the outpost to his commanders, and quickly followed his mate. The interior of the massive carriage was a completely different world. The moment Elowen stepped inside, the biting winter wind was instantly severed by the thick steel doors. A small, magically fueled hearth burned merrily in the corner of the cabin, filling the space with the comforting, rich scent of pine, burning embers, and expensive leather. Thick velvet curtains blocked out the dreary grey sky of the northern borders. She sat down on the plush leather bench, wrapping a thick woolen blanket securely around Toby, who had already fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep against the cushions. Elowen stared blankly at her own hands. A single, pristine flake of snow rested on her silk sleeve. She watched it slowly melt away into nothingness. The heavy door clicked open, and Caspian stepped inside. The massive warlord who had just terrorized an entire territory instantly vanished the second the latch secured them inside. He let out a long, ragged exhale, running his calloused hand tiredly through his dark hair. He sat down beside her, the incredibly close proximity immediately sparking the golden, comforting warmth of their mate bond. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and carefully gathered her into his lap. Elowen went willingly, melting against his broad, muscular chest. She rested her cheek against the heavy fabric of his tunic, listening to the steady, powerful thumping of his heart. For so long she had braced herself against the world, expecting every single hand to strike her, expecting every door to be locked in her face. But as Caspian wrapped his incredibly strong, warm arms around her, burying his face reverently in her silver hair, the final lingering shards of ice in her soul finally shattered. The carriage jolted slightly as the massive draft horses began their journey back to the capital. The ruined gates of her past faded away into the swirling whiteout, completely erased by the storm. She realized in the quiet rocking motion of the cabin that true power was not about forcing others to kneel in the snow. True power was having the courage to survive the freezing dark, long enough to finally step into the light. Even when you had to walk through fire to reach the other side, love wasn't something that happened to you by accident. Love was something you fought for. Love was the absolute, unyielding sanctuary you built with the people who chose you when the rest of the world turned away. And as Caspian held her tighter, silently swearing to the gods that he would never let her go, Elowen knew she would never step aside again. The curse of the winter was broken. The era of the outcast was dead. And somewhere in the warm, beating heart of the obsidian palace, a new golden legend was just beginning to bloom.